Good day, students. Welcome to the English class. Hope you're all safe. So, today we are going to see a play. So, before that, let me introduce the lesson. Okay. So, what do we see here? We see that a girl is running to school. Okay, because she's wearing the school uniform. Next, we see many students playing in the playground. Okay, just like you people used to play when you were called to school. Okay. Next, we see students. They are sitting and they are laughing and they are talking with their friends. And finally, we see this girl. She's studying very seriously. Okay. So we saw 4 pictures, and in all these pictures, what was the common thing? Okay, so all the common thing was that everything is related to school, studying, and education. Okay, so you people are very lucky. Your parents are giving you good education and they buy you things when you ask for them, right? Okay, so today we are going to see about a girl who was not given education and she was also not treated properly. Okay, so her name is Jane Eyre and the name of the lesson is also Jane Eyre. So we are going to see about the girl. So this is actually a novel. It was written by Charlotte Bronte. Charlotte Bronte. So this was a novel, but for our convenience, it is given in the drama format with dialogues and all. Okay. So we'll see a few points about Charlotte Bronte. So she was born in 1816, England, and there were actually 6 children in the family. So she published Jane Eyre in 1847. So to publish the book, she used a different name, Carabel. The name is Cara Bell. Okay, so this is because many years back women were not allowed to write books. So even if they wrote books, people did not read it. Okay, so because of this reason, Charlotte Bronte used a different name to publish the book. So she was also a poet and a novelist, and she died in 1855. So now we'll see a few difficult words. The first one is mischiefs, which means doing naughty activities, sometimes bad activities also. Next is uproar, which means making a loud noise. Next is dependent. So dependent is a person who always needs someone's help for small things in life. So they always need someone to help them. So behavior, the way in which a person acts. And finally, collapses means falls down. So I'll read the words once again. The first word is mischiefs. Next is uproar. Third is dependent. Fourth is behavior. Fifth is collapses. Moving on to the lesson. So this lesson actually has 3 parts. Okay. So the first part is what we are going to see today. So first part is at Gateshead. At Gateshead. So Gateshead is the place where Jane Eyre is staying. So she is a child now and she's staying in this place with her aunt and cousins. We'll see the characters now. The first is Jane Eyre. She's the main character. Next is Bessie. Bessie is the servant maid of the house. Okay. Next is John Reed. So John Reed is a cousin of Jane Eyre. And next is Georgina Reed. She is also Jane Eyre's cousin and she is John Reed's sister. Next is Eliza Reed. She is also Jane Eyre's cousin and sister of John and Georgina. And finally we have Mrs. Reed. She is Jane Eyre's aunt. So what are the characters we saw? Jane Eyre and Bessie, the servant maid. Next we saw the 3 cousins, John Reed, Georgina Reed and Eliza Reed. Finally we saw Mrs. Reed. She's the aunt. Okay, so we move on to the story. The first scene is involves Jane and Bessie. Okay, so we see Bessie here. So she asks Jane to stay out of mischiefs. We saw the meaning of mischiefs, no? Mischiefs means bad behavior. So Bessie asks Jane to stay away from bad activities and asks her to be a good girl. Okay, for this Jane says that Mrs. Reed does not notice even if Jane behaves badly also. And next, Bessie says that she's not talking about Mrs. Reed. She asks Jane to stay away from the cousins because she doesn't want any trouble or problems in the house. Okay, and for this, finally, Jane says she is not the one who's always starting the problem. That is, it is always the cousins, the three siblings who come and create problems. Okay, so Jane finally says she's going to read a book in the library, in Uncle Reed's library, and she's going to read Uncle Reed's book. Okay, Uncle Reed is actually dead, so we have only aunt and cousins. So in the next we see that Jane is sitting by the windowsill. So windowsill is basically a place near the window. Okay, you see there, right? Jane is sitting and reading a book. So at that time, the three siblings, that is the cousins, enter. So we see John, Georgina and Eliza. They come, and John says, what are you doing? He asks Jane what she's doing. So for that, she says she's reading a book. And John asks Jane to come and give the book to him. So Jane goes and she gives the book. Okay, so this is the book Jane is reading, Bewick's History of British Words. So this is Jane's book that she's reading, Bewick's History of British Birds. Okay, so once Jane goes near John, what happens? John asks her to stand near the window. Okay, stand far away from him, and he says this important dialogue: you have no business to take our books. You are a dependent. You have no money. Your father left you none. You ought to beg not to live here with gentlemen's children. Go stand by the door there and out of the mirror and the windows. Okay, see, this is what he says. He says Jane is very poor. She's just she's troubling Aunt Reed and the cousins. Okay, and John is very angry at Jane, so he asks her to go and stand near the window. So what he does, he hits her with something. So most probably he hits her with the book on the head. Okay, and what happens? Suddenly blood comes. 2 drops of blood comes from Jane's head. So seeing this, Eliza is frightened. So she starts screaming. So hearing the scream, Aunt Reed comes running. So this is Aunt Reed there. So instead of scolding John, so why scold John? Because John was the one who hit Jane, right? So she should scold John, but she did not scold John. What happened? She started scolding Jane. So she says, take her away to the red room and lock her in there. So red room was basically Uncle Reed's room. He died in that room. So the people who live in the house, they believe that Uncle Reed's ghost is still there. Okay, so no one goes to that room. So Aunt Reed is very cruel and she's angry, no? So she asks Bessie to take Jane to that room and lock her in there. Hearing this, Jane is very, very scared. Okay, so she started shouting and she's telling, I don't want to go there. So for this, Bessie says, come quickly, what shocking behavior for a young girl. So Bessie also scolds Jane. So she's very in a very bad place. Okay, because everyone's scolding her. So she's so sad. Okay, so coming back to the lesson, Bessie says this and she drags Jane and she locks her in the room. Okay, so Jane collapses to the floor and cries. So she's sitting there because she was pushed into the room. She's sitting there and she starts crying. Okay, suddenly Jane hears a noise, some noise she hears. She gets very frightened. She's so scared. She wants to go out. She starts screaming and she calls Mrs. Reed, she calls Bessie, and both of them come to the room and open and see that there is nothing there. There's nothing there. They don't hear the noise. So what Mrs. Reed, she scolds Jane for simply acting, and she locks the room and goes away. Finally, Jane is crying. Okay, and the next scene we see Jane wakes up. She is in a very comfortable, very soft bed. So once she wakes up, she asks Bessie, am I ill? I feel so ill. Am I going to die? So for this, Bessie says, no, no, you're not going to die. You're just sick. You have a fever because you were crying in the red room. So when you cry a lot, you become tired and weak, no? So that is what happened to Jane. So she's very weak and she falls sick. And for this, Jane says she did not cry simply. She heard a noise. She says it is Uncle Reed's ghost. So finally, Jane says, I shall never forget it, and she falls asleep because she's very tired. Okay, so she falls asleep. In the in the final part of the scene, we see that Mrs. Reed writes a letter to Mr. Brocklehurst. Writes a letter to Mr. Brocklehurst. So he is actually the owner of Lowood Institution. Lowood Institution. It's actually a school. Okay. So Mrs. Reed writes a letter and asks this owner to take her to school because she does not want to see Jane in the house. Because of that, Mrs. Reed sends Jane to Lowood Institution, which is the school. So this is a picture of the Lowood Institution we see here. So with this, the first part of this lesson ends. Okay, so we'll see the key points what we saw here. The first is Bessie asks Jane to be a good girl. Okay, she asks Jane to stay away from mischiefs. Then Jane goes to read a book, and suddenly the three cousins come and they start disturbing Jane. Right? John Reed calls Jane and he hits her with the book. Okay, and blood comes, Eliza is screaming, and for this, Jane is sent to the red room by Aunt Reed. Aunt Reed asks Bessie to lock Jane in the red room, and Jane is very scared. Later, she falls sick and is taken care of by Bessie. Okay, we see, right, that Jane is in bed and Bessie is taking care of her. Finally, Jane is sent to Lowood Institution. So here we end the class. Please read the first part. Okay, it's very interesting. Thank you.